Inara Verzemniak is the American author of the forthcoming memoir, Among the Living and the Dead, a tale of exile and homecoming on the war roads of Europe. Her essays in journalism have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Tin House, The Atlantic, the Iowa Review, and Creative Nonfiction. She is a Pushcart Prize winner, a recipient of the Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in feature writing. She previously worked as a newspaper journalist for 13 years and currently teaches at the University of Iowa.
Hi, I'm Inara, and I am interested in literary journalism. I have worked as a reporter for a number of years, and currently I am a professor in the nonfiction writing program teaching creative nonfiction. And today we're going to talk about adding voices to the portrait that you have constructed. One of the things that's really important if you have identified someone as a profile subject is to be able to place them in the context of their community. And how can you go about doing this? One way to start is to begin to look at those who surround that person. Who are people who are important in their life? Sometimes that's family. But what if we're dealing with a situation where someone perhaps doesn't have a family that they identify with as their immediate community? You begin to talk to them and see who carries weight in their life. Who is someone that they spend a lot of time with? Who is it someone that they define themselves in proximity to? So perhaps that's a neighbor. Perhaps that's someone that they spend time with in church. Perhaps that's someone that they meet every day at the grocery store. One way to be able to figure out who these people are, beyond simply just interviewing the person that you're writing about, is to spend a day with them. A day in the life, if you have the time, is usually a very, very good way. As you follow that person through their actions, through the quiet moments of their life, you see who they interact with. You see who comes up as someone who might be of importance and significance. Then your sort of responsibility is, or your hope is, to have a chance to spend some time talking to those people. It can be interesting sometimes to see how people interact. So one possibility is to arrange a time to talk together with the person that you're hoping to focus on and to have them interacting with those individuals. That will give you dialogue. That will give you conversation, not just sort of talking heads, disembodied with speech bubbles in the air. You'll actually have a give and take. Another option, though, because sometimes it's also interesting to hear the way that other people describe the person that you're writing about. And so you might take an opportunity to just have a few moments with those people who represent that person's community, separate from a conversation with that individual. I know when people ask me to talk about myself, sometimes I have a really hard time articulating what I think might be core qualities or important things for someone to know about me. We're so familiar with ourselves. We might not think of a significant detail that someone else who's a little bit outside of us would really be able to bring into play. Another thought is that what you want to do is also try to understand if that person is seen as a community member, to try to understand that other individual's identification with the community, to begin to understand their definition of the community that they're a part of. How do they look at it? How do they define it? What are the particular challenges that they feel in their life? What are the particular points of strength in their life that they possess? And why am I suggesting this? Because at this point, one of the things that you're trying to do is to sort of move back and forth between the idea of a collective story of community, and a sort of individual story within that community. And if you begin to think in these tracks, that offers you a lot more material in order to move back and forth in telling both a story that is representative of perhaps how something affects the entire community, but also the very different ways that individuals feel and experience significant events within their community. The other thing that you want to start thinking about, how do you identify what are perhaps strong and vibrant voices? I would say that the biggest piece of advice, especially when you're getting going with something like an introductory literary journalism project, is to trust your gut. To trust those moments when you feel just a real spark, when you feel animation, when you both feel comfortable talking to one another. That's a great place to begin to practice identifying for yourself what feels like strong material. If you feel that you are engaged, if you feel curious, if you feel surprise, if you feel wonder, if you feel disturbed, those are all markers of what is strong material. Maybe you feel a little intimidated and you're not really ready to go out and talk to strangers. Well, then you can practice this within your own community. You can practice trying to interview people who are familiar to you as if they were strangers. It's an interesting exercise to look at your life anew, to look at your life as someone entering it almost for the first time. So you can interview people who you consider part of your community and approach it as though you've never met them before. And in that moment, mark, even on the piece of paper where maybe perhaps you're trying to take notes or keep track of your thoughts, mark the moments where you feel something, where you feel that surprise, that wonder, a sense of maybe being startled, or just that you love what they said. You felt like they said it in a beautiful and engaging way. Go back and look at that. And then you can kind of affirm to yourself that you have a good gut instinct for what is interesting material, for what is a strong voice. Also, what I recommend is not just to simply engage with talking to people. It's important to think about just spending time in the environment without having to have a conversation. You were talking a bit about place and the significance of place in being able to define a community and define an individual. Well, even at this point, as you're beginning to consider how you add in other voices, it's still important to take some time to really just observe and take in details and think about what surrounds a person when they are going about their day-to-day life. What is the environment that they're in, but also very specifically, what are the everyday rituals that they are engaged in? We don't often stop and think about what we do day to day as a form of ritual, but it is. What do they do in the morning? How do they wake themselves up? What do they make for breakfast? Do they even have breakfast? What do they do? What do they do in order to, sort of get themselves out the door? And what kind of transportation do they take? Maybe there isn't immediate transportation. You just begin to think in terms of the way that it's not just passing action. Each gesture, each moment in someone's life carries a certain significance because it helps to place them inside the context of their community. One of the things that oftentimes when you're wondering, how do I find vibrant moments where my character isn't just sort of flat, sort of one-dimensional, like a cardboard cutout in a way that you feel like you're sort of moving around. What's really important, I think, and helpful is to think about that character in proximity to other people. I talked a little bit about the idea of taking moments to actively have your person have a sit-down conversation with someone else. Another strategy, though, that you might employ that would also give you dialogue, but beyond that, it would also give you action, is to find moments where you can have your main profile subject go out through the community with someone else who they feel is a member of their community, and have them offer you a guided tour of what they define as their community. What that gives you is both the opportunity to have dialogue, to have conversation, to have quotes, but it also gives you action. and that you have an immediate built-in scene. And so having them give you a tour of their community through their eyes also allows you sometimes to have what gives a piece complexity. And that is what I call the buddy rule. And the buddy rule immediately builds in a kind of tension because each person is going to experience the place in slightly different ways. Yes, they'll have some shared experience, but they might also have some differences in how they perceive the community or what they point out or what is significant to them. And what we want in writing, what makes writing interesting, are those points of tension. It isn't the moments when everything is all the same and all smoothed out. It's actually moments of difference. It's moments of disruption. It's moments of possible paradox. All that sounds really complicated, and yet here we have a very simple frame in which you can begin to discover all those elements and see how to bring them out in your writing. One of the hopes of this class is that you are able to use writing to address pressing issues that affect communities. How to write about these huge issues, how to write about social justice, how to do it through journalism. I think while that might seem daunting, we can often start in very basic, quiet, day-to-day places. When I am thinking about stories that I want to write about that draw attention to ways that people are being affected in their day-to-day lives by questions of injustice, the place I always begin is exactly right there, people's day-to-day lives. Oftentimes, these issues are talked about in such huge, abstract ways. And your ability as a writer is to actually move past abstraction and help people to see what it looks like in the most basic and most urgent sense. It's not in the huge abstractions that people are most affected. People are affected right inside their homes, right inside the daily choices that they make. So where do you begin? I would think about perhaps what seems to be something that you might identify as a problem. That'll be big. That'll be big. But then back up and ask yourself, what does that problem look like when someone is trying to just live? So in my case, one of the recent pieces that I worked on, I was interested in looking at what it looked like for people who lacked health insurance in the United States. What did that, not just like the issue, what does it mean to not have health insurance in a general sense? I wanted to know, how did that affect their daily choices? How did that seep into every other part of their life? And I mentioned the way that doing a sort of day in the life or asking someone to give you a guided tour can be quite helpful. You might say to yourself, if you have identified a problem, do you know someone near to you in your community who perhaps is affected by this particular issue? And then I would say, spend the day with them. And rather than only just looking for that issue, look at how they're adapting because of that issue. I'm always interested in not simply presenting people as having problems or pathologizing the things that they're going through. I want to show how they're adapting despite all of these difficulties and all of these things that have been put upon them. I'm so amazed at how strong people can be and the solutions that they can come up with. And it's those solutions that they come up with in their day-to-day lives that's often invisible to everyone else. We don't see it. It almost is too small for anyone to notice, or it happens inside a home, behind closed doors. Only the people close to them actually really understand the amount of strength that they possess to go through a single day. So, you've identified a person who perhaps experiences that problem. Spend the day with them and focus on the ways in which they are adapting, the end runs that they're coming up with to get around this problem. In my case, in focusing on people who lacked health insurance, one of the things that I did was I spent time in a particular community center that served people who lacked health insurance. They offered free healthcare. So for a while, I treated that in some ways as a locus of the community. I spent time in waiting rooms. I talked to the doctors and nurses who worked with these people and talked to people in the waiting rooms who wanted to talk to me. And when I found someone who said, yes, I lack insurance and I would love for you to understand what that looks like in my life. So I literally went over to their house and spent the day from morning to dinner time. And I got a really clear sense of the way in which this wasn't just an issue for them. This affected every little bit of who they were and the decisions they had to make. So for example, when I went over to the home of a woman who's been working at McDonald's, one thing that was really significant was as soon as she tried to feed her kids, she was exhausted still in her work uniform, she had to set up a plate for herself to eat and at the same time spent some time going through the newspaper and cutting out coupons which would allow her to save money on her next grocery bill. There was a huge stack of coupons this big. That was something so significant for her because she had to watch every penny. If she were to fall sick, that would cost her a tremendous amount. So she's just constantly thinking about how to get ahead of what might be the next potential thing that could set her very far back, because she's already kind of hanging on in some ways. Any little disruption, even just getting a cold and having to go to the doctors and get over-the-counter cold medication, that $10 bill, might be something that would really hurt her. So in some ways, the clipping of coupons was a way that she could try to control her situation and get ahead. That significant little detail illustrates the depth of the issue, the depth of the problem. So for you as a writer, that moment gives you a tangible, concrete thing to describe that allows you to get at the heart of the problem without having to make a blanket statement that it is wrong when people lack health insurance. So when doing this work where you are trying to inhabit a community and understand the inner workings of the community, oftentimes, if it's not a community that's familiar to you, you are dependent on what I tend to call guides. And those are people who you can trust because they have a lot of connections and intersections within the community. And you can go to them and ask them to help perhaps introduce you to other people and to offer advice. But that raises an interesting question. Who is a representative of a community? And how do you sort of test that as a writer? One thing that is very important in the practice of journalism is always building into your process this idea of testing. And so you never want to rely on a single source. You want to always test that source and test things that you're discovering from that source with other people. And so while you may find someone who is perhaps a self-identified representative of the community, someone who's helping to guide you through the community, it is always helpful to seek out perspectives from others on what they think of that person, even if it's something that never enters into your story. We call this background reporting. Maybe it's something that never ever makes it into the body of the story, but it helps you as a writer just to make sure that you're not going on any assumptions or there aren't any blind spots that are perhaps leading you astray. The other thing that oftentimes we encounter when we're writing about people, even people who might be familiar to us, we might be irritated by them at times. We might find them a difficult personality to deal with. What I want to suggest at this point in this stage of your process, remember I said earlier, it is helpful sometimes to make notes to yourself on when something strikes you, when you feel wonder, when you feel startled, when you feel surprised. I think it's also helpful to just try, whether it's mentally, but I do think it's helpful to try to put it on paper, is to note when someone annoys you. It may never enter into the story, but it is important to be clear with yourself on what your reactions are. And when you do that, you're better able to navigate not letting sort of an internal bias influence what you're writing. You can just kind of hold it out there, pay a little bit of attention to it, see it as part of your process, but it doesn't necessarily have to enter into your piece. But it might signal something that you should be paying attention to. Just because you don't like someone and they are an integral part of this community, maybe doesn't affect your story at all. But it also could be yet another signal that it's worth talking to other people in the community, getting their impressions, testing what you discover against their impressions. One of the things that's amazing about doing research-based work, about doing journalism, is that as you begin to talk to people, as you begin to explore, you may make new discoveries. You may find new things that you didn't expect to find. And while that is an amazing part of this particular kind of writing, it can also be a frustrating part of this kind of writing, because you might feel like it's overwhelming if you don't have a very clear idea. So how do you balance that, having a very clear idea with still remaining open to the possibility that you might have to abandon what it was that you thought you were going to write about? In your case, you might have identified someone as the person that you want to profile and to place in the context of a community. And maybe now, as you're beginning to add more voices from the community into your project, you might see that there are other people that feel maybe even more compelling or equally compelling, and you're sort of reconsidering the choice that you made. One thing that you might consider is that it is also possible, rather than to simply abandon a character and go in a different direction, this idea of foregrounding and backgrounding characters. And so what you might play with is that you might have chosen someone who seemed like the central person that you were going to be writing about. Well, if you're discovering other people who seem more compelling, stronger voices, you might see what happens if you go ahead and put them in the foreground and perhaps background the voice of the original character that you focused on last week. What does it look like if they remain, perhaps, if you might think of like music, they remain a part of the chorus, but maybe they aren't the sort of main melody that you're listening to? What do they add? How do they add to the story of some of these other voices that you're listening to? When I was working on that story about people who lacked health insurance, I was at first operating from a place where I thought I had a central character who would be the main focus of the story. But I began to realize that rather than being the focal point of the story, in some ways, she was the heart of the story. She was something that other voices surrounded. While that isn't technically the background, it certainly didn't mean that she was the person that I started with and the person that I ended with. She was someone that I wanted to hold the center of the story, and I felt that everyone else around her only amplified the particularity of her situation, but it gave a kind of weight, it gave a kind of presence to the piece. And you might have to be flexible in that sort of way where for a while you're thinking, this is my main character. And then later you realize, no, this is more of a supporting character. But that doesn't mean that they are not critical to the overall understanding that someone will take away about the issue that you're writing about.